have any technical difficulties.
It didn't connect at first.
Oh, so we're still.
So I connected it and then lost it after about 2 minutes.
Oh, really?
So I got it.
Okay.
This is unlocked, so if you lose it,
Okay.
I've got all the information all ready, so I'm prepared today.
Yeah, I don't know why the problems.
Maybe the weather. I don't know.
Who knows? Well,
Sometimes it's the weather. Sometimes there's just a lot of traffic on, those lines that we're using.
yeah.
That's what I think it is.
Oh, really?
So
Okay. Well, as far as I know, this is the last one for this semester. We don't have a schedule for next semester, so
Okay.
we'll see what happens. I'll just, obviously let you guys know as soon as I know something. But anyway, that's where we are for now. And yeah, I did bring a cell phone number of one of the people, so that if something happens, at least I can call them and say, I'm still here. We lost connection or whatever. Because last week they were trying to email me, and I didn't bring my computer last week. So, but anyway, I wrote down the seminar facilitator's phone number, so she's got a cell phone in case something happens. At least we can talk. So.
Perfect. Yeah, and I've got Kim. I got Kim's number and 2 numbers that we used to connect with. So.
Okay.
Yeah, I've got it all separated out.
Great.
So I don't have to go
okay.
searching.
Well, thank you.
Oh yeah, no problem. All right, enjoy your class.
Thank you very much.
Hello.
Hello.
Are we starting? Are you connected with the Logan campus?
I am, yeah.
Huh. I would think they would be starting by now, but.
Yeah, they are about ready to start. We've had technical difficulties on our end the last couple weeks getting connected. I don't know if that's what's happening to you too.
Okay.
Yeah, in fact, we had trouble earlier. It took a couple of shots before we got it today.
Well, you're coming in loud and clear, but I don't see anyone else, so I was just wondering.
I know, that's sort of funny. The remote sites actually see and hear each other better than either of us see or hear the main site. Mm-hmm. Not sure why that happened.
All right, that sounds good. Thank you so much. Appreciate it.
You want me to do something?
You want to just say yeah. Say Salt Lake talk for a second.
Salt Lake, talk for a second, please.
Say something really.
Hi, Rob.
Tell him his
Howdy.
mic's on. Mic's on.
Rob, do you know that your mic's on?
I do know that it's on, yes.
Okay.
Okay. Does he just like to keep it on the whole time? Cool.
Salt Lake, are they there?
Well, they should be. Yeah, there's somebody in there.
Yeah, John's there.
Salt Lake City, if you can hear us, can you say something, please?
Can you hear me? I can hear you.
Oh, yes.
Okay. See, now it'll just switch. Well, that'll work.
You're in.
Are you going to talk?
No.
No?
Tell me about it.
I do.
One of my best friends took it on the blog.
Aw. Wow. What was her name? Oh, she did great, too.
Is it from other cultures as well?
This audience has the distinct feel of the last day of the semester.
It says pomegranate juice
Extracted from Turkey.
extracted
From Turkey. That's like those apricots that say that have turkey parts in them.
Eat them in Turkey. Well, it's like those. The cats, and they pass from the cat, and then they're all like.
Right. Okay, so I guess I'll go ahead and get started. Giving a seminar on the last day of the semester is somewhat analogous to giving the last talk on Friday of a conference at 4:45. So it's been a long semester and it's been a long week for me too. So I would really rather that we kept this interactive. And if you want to interrupt me or say something or ask a question, please just do so. So I had a hard time figuring out what my title would be, and I actually had to think really hard about this presentation because when I look around the room, I feel like I'm kind of the least common denominator. I feel like I'm more different from everybody else and everybody else in here, but maybe that's just a personal bias of being, a narcissist or something. But so the title I came up with was just very general, linking water quality and quantity to fish performance and viability. And I'm going to talk about two different examples. But alternatively, my title could be At Last Some Ecology, which is what I put down here. So I do have the advantage of, almost going last, and so I have had the chance to listen to a lot of people in here and to think a lot about our project. And so I tried to put those thoughts into this presentation in terms of how I could contribute to this project overall. And so that's really how I tried to frame it. So I'm going to talk about two examples from my research that I think are really sort of the nexus of fish conservation or fish management and water management for me. And that's not necessarily all that I do. And so they're just the best examples that I could come up with from my research. So I'll talk a bit about what I do. I wanted to really make sure I gave an overview of the tools that I use that we could then go forward to use in the future. I actually took a little bit of time with a couple of these projects to talk about what I don't do or what I don't know how to do that we could do if we were tackling this project as this group. And I was hopeful that would stimulate some dialogue and then some unintended consequences of some other parts of these projects that I don't really even dabble in. But I would if I was doing this with all of you. So the two examples that I chose to talk about are one on the San Rafael River, which is in southern Utah. And the approximate title of this project is Maintaining Population Persistence in the Face of an Extremely Altered Hydrograph. And then the second example that I'll talk about just for much more briefly, but I do have like 90 minutes, right? is Predicting Fish Growth Potential and Identifying Water Quality Constraints, a Spatially Explicit Bioenergetics Approach. And this is closer to home in Cutler Reservoir. And I chose this project because I know there's a lot of us in the audience that have worked in Cutler Reservoir or in the Bear River, and I do think it has a lot of, I think it's potentially a good candidate for a model system for us to think about working on as we do move forward. Okay, so for the first example, this is the San Rafael River. This is a little bit of foreshadowing. This is the San Rafael River in 2007. And this research I completed with my research associate, Gary Thiede, and then two graduate students, Jared Botcher, who finished in 2009, and Tim Walsworth, who's doing his research currently. And the San Rafael River was a site that was selected. The project wasn't necessarily site specific, but we chose the San Rafael River because it's typical of many of the rivers of this region and of many of the desert rivers in terms of the sources of degradation. But it's also home to 3 very special fishes. They're non-charismatic. I think they're charismatic. Desert fishes that formerly people have cared very little about. They're managed as a complex. They're the flannel sucker, the round-tailed chub, and the bluehead sucker. They're all shown here. They're managed as a complex because they tend to co-occur, and when they do co-occur, it's an indicator of ecosystem health if all 3 of them are present. They're also managed as a complex because we don't know very much about all 3 of them, so it's just easier just to lump them together. They're all protected under a conservation agreement, which is the goal of which is to try and avoid listing in the future. And they all used to make many of the tributaries of the Colorado River their home. They're now restricted to about 50% of their range, and they're incredibly imperiled. My guess is that the round-tailed chub will be listed within the next couple of years. And so I'll probably refer to them as the 3 species for the rest of this example. These desert fishes are highly adapted to their harsh desert environment. They're highly adapted in terms of they're very fecund, they're very long-lived, they show wide ranges of movement, very large home ranges, so they can be in one place to avoid something that's happening in a different place. They're highly adapted to stochastic events like droughts and floods, the latter of which is really important, floods, because it forms the habitat. It forms and maintains the habitat that they need. And so large snowmelt events coming down the San Rafael River and other rivers like this are what form the pools, the riffles, the backwaters that they need to feed, to grow, to reproduce, to survive, so that their offspring survive, to reproduce, et cetera, et cetera. And so those big flows are very important. And if we had time, Jack would give you an entire seminar on just that component of the San Rafael River, what forms the fish habitat. So the San Rafael River, just a few statistics about it. It's a tributary to the Green River. You can see it over here in sort of central eastern Utah. It's about 140 kilometers long. It drains Cottonwood, Huntington, and Farron Creeks and the Wasatch Plateau. This is a cartoon that I stole from another presentation, so these little dots don't mean too much, but here are the different tributaries, and this is a barrier that I'll talk about a little bit more at Hat Ranch. You might note that, and there's the sort of the confluence with the Green River. We chose to do this project in the San Rafael River because all 3 of the 3 species are still presently there, which is not true for much of the range of the 3 species across their historical range. In addition, as I alluded to, it's a river that's very typical of these rivers in the desert of the Intermountain, or deserts of the West. It's notorious for being the most over-allocated river in all of Utah, and I can't remember how many diversions and dams there are on it, but obviously there's many. And clearly, those dams and diversions have altered the hydrograph, and that altered hydrograph has had impacts on the fish communities that are there. In addition, there's barriers to fish passage, which are sometimes associated with the diversions, not always. There's vast stands of tamarisk that have become established along the riparian zone, and there's also many exotic fishes in the system, which I won't talk about at all today, but which are all of these are threats to these imperiled desert fish, the 3 species. And so those diversions and dams have, as you would expect, resulted in a very altered hydrograph. Here you have discharge along the y-axis, time across a typical year along the x-axis, and then we have the contemporary hydrograph shown in blue, right here, 1999 to 2007, and the historical hydrograph shown in red, 1910 to 1918. So you can see that the spring flood has been incredibly dampened from what it used to be, and this is typical. This graph would be similar across many years of the time series of the hydrograph. In addition to this dampened spring flood, we also have extended periods of no flow, where the river is completely dewatered. And so in 2007, you can see about a 2-month time period where there was no water in the river, and that's because it was diverted, not because it was a natural drought issue. We know that historically these rivers would have had some time periods where some parts of the river were probably dry, but it probably didn't happen for very long, not a very extended time period, and it certainly didn't happen every other year or so. So what does that mean for fish? Well, fish need connectivity. They need to be able to move between different habitat types. They typically reproduce in one place, feed in another place. Their young would rear in another place, and they have to be able to move from those different habitat types to fulfill all those different biological needs in order to complete their life cycle. So when we dewater a reach, as you've seen in the previous slide, it really results in a loss of connectivity, so they can't move among those different habitat types. In addition, it has a direct effect of just killing fish. These little pools that remain when they dewater the lower 60 kilometers of the San Rafael, which is sort of the focus of today. I should have said that when I had the map up. These pools get very hot, they go anoxic, and all the fish in them die, the exotics and the native fish. And so we've lost connectivity, which is a very important aspect of these fish and the systems that they're adapted to. In addition, because the magnitude of the peak flow has been so dramatically reduced, we've also lost the river has lost its ability to form and maintain complex habitat. So here you can see the annual peak stream flow along the y-axis, again, time in years along the x-axis. And then you can see the magnitude of these peak flows. And so for the first, I don't know, the earlier part of this time series, you can see that we had some very, very large peak flows. And that sort of average peak flow is around 4,000. If you come over to here after about 1988, you'll see that there's very few peak flows that actually ever get up to 4,000. There's none of these really big gangbuster floods at all. What is the result that that has? What are the implications of that for fish? Well, we've lost all of our complex habitats. So most of the San Rafael River now looks a lot like this. It's just a basic run. There's very few riffles. There's very few backwaters. There's very few pools, aggregations of pools. It's just one big sort of irrigation ditch looking quite shallow, sandy bottom, very simplified riverine system because those flows simply aren't there anymore. And hopefully next semester, Jack will give a talk where he can touch upon some of the geomorphological reasons that this has occurred.
Pedro?
Yes?
I know a lot of rivers have in-stream flow requirements. Why doesn't this one?
Jack, do you know the answer to that?
I'm sure it's adjudicated at this point, but
well, I guess for one, species are, you mean for something other than fish or for fish?
For fish.
Well, for one, the most obvious reason would be that nobody even knew about or even cared about the three species until maybe 2 or 3 years ago. So they really are just they have no economic value. They're not listed under the Endangered Species Act. They're just not on anybody's radar.
yeah, I mean, I guess ultimately people don't care. There's no, I mean, in a sense, there's no enviro group who champions this place.
Got it.
There's no Federal Reserve water right attached with BLM jurisdiction. And yeah, I think it's mostly, it's nobody who cares. And now that the nexus is, now that the species are identified, they occupy the place, now the state is desperate to keep these fish from being federally listed.
Right.
There might be a future mandate.
If they are listed, then will there be a mandate? Is that automatic or is it?
No.
I can come back. I'll come back to that at the end. Keep that thought because I did put a little bit of policy in here at the end. So with that context, we had a whole bunch of different goals of this research project. It's been going on for 4 or 5 different years, but just for purposes of simplification for our purposes in this presentation today, the primary objective that I want to talk about was our efforts to identify factors that limit the distribution and the abundance and the persistence of these 3 species in the San Rafael River and connecting tributaries or connecting water bodies. So I'm not going to talk hardly at all about methods today. Specifically, I'm not going to get down in the weeds about fish sampling methods, but just so you can get a general idea of this project, we have the approximately lower 60 kilometers of the San Rafael River, which is the focus of what I'm talking about today. We broke it up and we sampled 22 reaches, which are 200 to 300 meters long, systematically every year in May, something like July, and then something like fall. And we've been doing that for about 4 years. And I should also point out, these stars denote passive pit tag antenna, which are places that we can detect fish moving in the upstream direction or the downstream direction, and or just get a recapture so we know everything about that fish from the time that it was tagged on, if it's still alive, where it went, etc. We use a whole bunch of general basic fish sampling techniques, electroshocking with a canoe, seining, fyke nets, whatever you can think of. We try almost everything. It's a very difficult river to work in. All of the target species that we capture are tagged with a pit tag, which allows us to detect that fish passively from that point on into the future, and it records all the individual information about that fish, so it gives us the entire history of that fish across time. And again, we do have these 2 antennas. One's down at the mouth of the Green River, and then one's up closer to the first diversion, fish passage, barrier and diversion. And these antennas allow us to note the direction of movement and also just to recapture the fish. At all those sites, we also measure a suite of habitat characteristics that we use to describe fish habitat, water depth, water velocity, substrate size, whatever you, all the different things that you usually think of when you think of fish habitat. And so then what do we do with all this? So if we then go back and look across all these different reaches, and we know that a lot of the river looks a lot like this, we can then categorize the amount of the distribution of percent habitat along the longitudinal gradient of this river. And so that's what you see here. So we have the percentage of complex habitat. And we were very liberal with complex habitat. It was anything that was non-run habitat. And then here, this is the mouth of the Green River. Here's that antenna. These are all of the different reaches that you saw in that sampling slide. And then these are a few sites above this Hat Ranch diversion that I'll come back to, with one up in the the San Rafael swell. And so what you can see is that across all of these reaches, the amount of the percentage of complex habitat is very, very low, and it's also incredibly patchy. So that's interesting. But what's more interesting is that if you then superimpose on top of it the abundance and the composition of these three species, there's a one-to-one relationship. So all the fish are using every tiny piece of complex habitat in the entire river. If there's anything there, a boulder that has a little tiny riffle, the smallest little backwater, there are fish there. And the rest of the river is pretty much void of habitat that they can use. And so this is certainly a limiting factor for them. This is a relationship between the total native fish density and the percent complex habitat, and it's a very, very good relationship. I think the R-squared is something like 0.9 something. So the fish are using all complex habitat that's available. In addition, we can look at the timing and the magnitude and the direction of fish movement and relate that to this changed hydrograph. And so here you have fishes moving upstream in red and downstream in blue. And you can see that these fish are moving primarily during the spring, in May, June, and July. And so that suggests that they are very adapted to moving when either it was very easy to get downstream because lots of water was moving downstream, or a time when it was easy to move upstream because you could ensure that there would actually be water in the system. And so if you superimpose on top of that the hydrograph, so you have the historical hydrograph in the black line and the contemporary hydrograph in the magenta line, you can see that yes, in fact, they are tightly cued in to the spring flood, and that it's when the largest degree of movement, this very important movement among these different habitat types occurs. So that tells you that this movement timing is very important and that they're very highly adapted to this system. But another thing we can look at here is this time period, which is shown between these two arrows, between about June and August, when in 2007, when the river was completely dewatered for 2 months. If we compare that to other years where we have fish movement where there still was water in the river, we can see that a lot of fish are still trying, even though most of them are moving over here, they're still trying to move during this time period where in 2007 it was completely dry. Clearly that's a very big problem in terms of connectivity and fish moving among habitat types. And so we can take all this information that was just sort of a little snapshot there. We can put it in a random forest analysis. Many of you are probably familiar with random forests. A whole series of different card analyses are bootstrapped, really good for small sample size and messy ecological data, and very good for sort of nonlinear relationships. And the top variables that come out, the ones that are most important, there's some consistency across the three different fish. So we have the three different fishes arranged here. And the number one most important variable for explaining the abundance of these fish was the distance to a source population. The source population for us was a place that was never dewatered and that they always had access to. And so that was important for all three of the fish. Then there's also some characteristics associated with habitat. So mean depth always comes out, percent non-run usually comes out on the top, and then exotic fishes here. And so that tells us that the two most important limiting factors for these fish are how far away they are from a population of fish that does not get dewatered and the availability of complex habitat. And that's a relatively intuitive answer, but it's nice to see it confirmed. And so this then suggests that the San Rafael River is really operating, is really driven by source sink dynamics. And so we have a source up above this fish barrier, which I've been referring to as Hat Ranch, that's coming out of the San Rafael swell. There's still very, very good habitat in the San Rafael swell. It's never dewatered, or I don't think it's ever dewatered. And then you have this really, really long stretch of about 60 kilometers, which has horrible habitat. It is dewatered for sometimes 2 months out of the year. And this is a sink, and so fish that are here at the wrong time of year are not going to survive, or they're not going to be able to find habitat that they can use to feed, to grow, to reproduce, etc. And then the Green River down here at the confluence can be a source and a sink because fishes that move out of the San Rafael River now at a small size into the Green River are now immediately hit with a whole suite of exotic predators that may gobble them up. And so while that may have been a good refuge at one time in the evolutionary history of these fish, it's now probably makes this place somewhat of a sink. It is also a source, though, because if these fish are smart enough to move out of here as the water levels start to go down before it starts to dry up, then they can go down to the Green River and wait until the river has water in it again. So both a source and a sink. But so strong source-sink dynamics driving the system, the distance to a source being really, really important, as I said, and then also the percentage of complex habitat. So if you look at all that, it might seem moderately intuitive, I hope, and you would think, well, the answer is very simple. Fish need water, so you don't have to hire a researcher at a big-name university to come up with this answer. But yeah, right. But it's actually not that simple, and this really relates to some of the things we've been sort of struggling with in this group. So fish need water to persist, to eat, to grow, and to reproduce, to disperse, and to mix. They also need water to maintain habitat. So this is sort of like the bare minimum. They need water to live. They also need water to form and maintain habitat, the complexity of the habitat, the connectivity of the habitat, in order to eat, grow, reproduce, disperse, and mix, etc. But why is this not happening in the San Rafael River? Well, Jack did give you some sort of a sense. I make a parallel or comparison to the San Rafael that it's like a black hole. That's how I always think of it in my mind. And I was really excited when I looked up the definition of a black hole to see how right it was. So the definition of a black hole is that it's an object or a region of space where the pull of gravity is so strong that nothing can escape from it. That's what I think of with the San Rafael, and why? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons that are really sort of interesting. There's almost no relationship whatsoever between precipitation and the amount of water that reaches the lower San Rafael River. That makes it very difficult. You can be a very, very smart hydrologist, water manager, fish ecologist, geomorphologist, but when you don't have a link between precipitation and water, it makes it sort of difficult. Why? Well, water is diverted out higher up in the system. It's stored and it's wasted. And it's wasted, it's used very loosely, and it's wasted because people are very scared of losing their water right. So, for example, last year, where does last year fit in terms of big year, little year for precipitation for this region, Jack? Medium?
Yeah.
Yeah, it was sort of a medium water year. We did not expect to have too many water problems. But there's this reservoir, Huntington North, which is right here, shown way up here. Here's Huntington, where their water right states that any water remaining in the reservoir on November 1 reverts back to the BOR water right, and it's lost forever. And so what these guys do is they pump their reservoir full of water, and then this year they didn't need it, and so in October they pumped it out onto frozen, dry fields that were not even in crop, so that that water would not be lost forever. That's all water that could go downriver for the fish. So that's why I think of it as a black hole. Why else do I think of it as a black hole? Well, if you had improved efficiency of diversions and or if you purchase water rights upriver, it doesn't result in any more water going downriver. This is sort of like the lack of relationship between precipitation and the amount of water in the lower river. So the UDWR has been trying to buy rights above that Hat Ranch diversion and to retrofit some of these diversions so that they're much more efficient. And when they do that, in theory, more water would come downriver. But because the river is so over-allocated, the next person downriver from the diversion that was just made more efficient now says, oh, I've been waiting for years to get this water, and that person takes it. So that doesn't seem to be doing that much either. And that's a little bit of an exaggeration, but you can get this basic gist of it. And then third, we're just doing all kinds of really crazy things down in the desert. So here is, I think this ranch is called Ruby Ranch. It's at the confluence of San Rafael and the Green River. Here you can see what the desert's supposed to look like, and here you can see what the desert does look like. So we're growing alfalfa. It requires gobs and gobs of water. Why are we doing this in this region? You just can't even believe it when you go there, that anybody would possibly be trying to grow alfalfa there. And not only are we growing alfalfa in the middle of the desert, we're also growing pheasants. And so the UDWR grandfathered this ranch, which is called Hat's Ranch, which is at a very major diversion and fish barrier and has a huge water right. They grandfathered it over to the UDWR. They gave it away, the people who used to own it. But they grandfathered into their agreement that it had to be used to grow pheasants, and then people go there and shoot them. They let them out of a cage, and then somebody goes up and shoots it. But pheasant require a lot of grass. It's actually greener and fresher than what you see here. And then grandfathered into this arrangement that if they were going to have this ranch, they had to grow pheasants, and they had to use the water right to grow pheasants. And so here's a whole bunch of water that is owned by UDWR, but it can't even be used for fish. And so, black hole. Yeah? Chime in.
Yeah, it's actually just a little bit more perverse. Utah,
Can it be?
Utah Power and Light bought the property.
Oh.
And Utah Power and Light bought the water rights. And then they donated everything to the division. And by doing so, they got credit for their upstream depletion.
Right.
So it was a third, it actually, it's a little bit more perverse political history.
So I thought I would just round this up by saying, okay, well, what can I do? Well, I can go out and measure fish, and I can tell you what the limiting factors are for fish. I can even build a population matrix model. I can sample water years from the historical hydrograph, and I can shoot forward 30 years into the future. I could even superimpose climate change on this. These are all things that I can do, and I can tell you what is the likely condition of these fish in the future. And if I were to do that right now, I would tell you that they're all plummeting to extinction. We're losing about 60% of them every generation. But what I can't do is deal with this problem that there's no relationship between precipitation and water. It's very difficult for me to figure out how to model the unpredictable human behavior that is associated with this system. All of those things that we just talked about are just completely nonsensical to me. When they explained this whole pheasant operation, they had to explain it to me 3 times. I was just so confused. They must have thought I was a numbnut. And so it's just completely impossible for me to figure out how to incorporate this into the population viability analyses for these fish for the future. And so that's a good example of something that we could maybe do better collectively together. So I'm going to switch gears now and just talk briefly about Cutler Reservoir. But before I do, does anybody have any questions more about this project? Because we're going to really change gears. No? Okay. You can think about that some more. So I do want to talk about Cutler Reservoir because it's a very different type of project for me and a very different sort of tool set that I've used here. This is research that I completed with Matt Baker and a master's student, Kirk Dolly, in 2009. So it was a couple of years ago. And again, the title is something like Predicting Fish Growth Potential and Identifying Water Quality Constraints, a Spatially Explicit Bioenergetics Approach. So why would you study fish in Cutler Reservoir? Well, it has a long and sordid history of water quality problems, although I would note that it has a long history of sort of poorly documented water quality problems. It's sort of just the theory that it has water quality problems. It is listed as an EPA 303D list, impaired water body, and it has been the focus of a fairly comprehensive TMDL study, which I think many people in this room, or who would normally be in this room, have participated in. It's designated by the state as a warm water sport fishery, but it's not really managed as a fishery. And there's incredibly limited fisheries data available. Of all the projects that I've worked on in my career, the least amount of fisheries, prior fisheries information was actually available for Cutler Reservoir. I was really pretty stunned. So those are all sort of the very local reasons why you might study fish in Cutler Reservoir. But why else might you? Well, you can take this up another level. And quantitative relationships between water quality and fish performance are actually incredibly elusive. They're very elusive because those effects are often synergistic. They're often many relationships that co-vary, so it's very difficult to tease out what is actually the relationship between the water quality and the fish. They're difficult because fish leave the places where water quality is bad when the water quality is bad, and so that doesn't mean that the water is not bad, it just means that they don't want to be there anymore. And so there's all these different reasons why it's actually pretty elusive and it's a difficult thing to do, and so we were sort of intrigued to actually try and do it, and we wanted to try and do it mechanistically and quantitatively, not just more qualitatively. And so if I were to simplify the whole project down into just a pretty general question, I would say that our goal is to determine what determines fish performance, and what is the relationship between water quality and fish performance in Cutler Reservoir. So what is that tie, and is there one? So again, I'll just skim over methods really, really fast, but we did break the reservoir up into 5 segments. So these are long segments, and within each segment we designated a sample site. At each of these sample sites, we sampled the whole suite of fisheries characteristics, as well as some logical data, which I'll come back to. We did this, so these sites are ranged all the way up from Newton down to what we call the southern tributaries, and we have one site over here on the Bear. And so we're trying to capture the incredible heterogeneity of this system. It's a very, very large reservoir, very, very spatially complex. We sampled in spring, summer, and fall, and we did this from 2005 through 2007. Fish sampling techniques, we use gill nets, trap nets, staining, electrofishing, the whole gamut to try and get a measure of the entire fish community, small fish, big fish, juvenile fish, adult fish, whatever you can think of. We also sampled a whole suite of abiotic and biotic variables that are either known to have a relationship with fish or to potentially have a relationship with another variable that has a relationship with fish. So temperature, we use strings of temperature loggers, and we'll come back to that in a minute. Dissolved oxygen, chlorophyll, nutrients, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. We knew that Cutler Reservoir, immediately after doing just a little bit of research, was incredibly heterogeneous in terms of temperature. And so in addition to our temperature loggers, which could vary by an order of magnitude if they were in the front of this room versus the back of the room, we also supplemented that temperature logger information with a couple of other different sources. So we used a helicopter-mounted thermal infrared imaging. We had a flight flown once in July. And so that gave us a spatially continuous snapshot of the temperature of Cutler Reservoir. And then we also combined that with Landsat 5 band and 6 TIR, which gave us then a temporal ability so we could crosswalk that space into time. And so that combination of things gave us a continuous measurement of temperature across space and a continuous measurement across time, which is a really special treat to have in a fisheries research project. Very fine scale thermal data on a continuous scale. So this is a pretty complex analysis. Matt Baker was involved, so that should tell you that it was definitely complex. And this is the diagram that we have in our manuscript, and I'm not going to go through that now, but I just put it up here so that you could get a sense that I'm just sort of skimming over what we did right now. But I did just simplify the approach into these 3 different tiers that I have here. We start off using a mechanistic bioenergetics modeling approach, and I'll come back to that. And our goal was to predict fish growth potential, to say where do fish do well in the reservoir and where do they do poorly, when, and why. The next tier was to do a spatial analysis of continuous remotely sensed thermal habitat suitability. So then make this analysis spatially explicit across time and space. And then the last tier was to use a structural statistical model. This was Matt's contribution to try and identify these relationships between fish performance and water quality. And I'll come back to that as well. So let's just go through a few results now. One of the most amazing things that happened was just some of our most fundamental fisheries data was incredibly interesting and very, very surprising to a wide number of people. Cutler Reservoir is anecdotally thought to be incredibly impaired, highly polluted, to have very few fish, to be a place that fish would never be, to just generally be sort of a cesspool. But people knew very, very little about it. And so we were really surprised. We captured 14 different fish, and even though there is a huge percentage of the fish that is made up of carp, which are thought of as some as a trash fish, there's no such thing as a trash fish, but we still did see a pretty significant contribution of other fish like walleye, catfish, black bullhead, and black crappie. And these fishes over here are highly prized sport fish. And so people were surprised to find out that they were there and that they were actually doing pretty well. And although there is a very high percentage of carp, which can live everywhere, they're providing a very important food source for fishes higher up in the food chain. And so, in addition to finding that there is a pretty substantial portion of sport fish, there's also trophy-sized walleye in Cutler Reservoir, which was really a shock to people, especially the Utah Division of Wildlife Resources that doesn't even manage the reservoir because they think it's just a write-off. And so those walleye are eating these carp, and these carp are eating all the poop that goes into Cutler. And so it was sort of a surprise to a lot of people that this system was so diverse for fish. So the fish community is large, and it's diverse, and it's in relatively good condition. And so you could summarize it with this carp saying that I like poop, and the walleye saying, but I like you. And so fundamentally, that was a surprising result. Everybody was a little bit, was unexpected. So then the next thing we can do is to say, okay, well, the fish community is diverse, and it is relatively large, and it is in relatively good health, but there must be some relationship between fish performance and water quality, and what are the factors that are limiting fish. And so in order to do that, we used fish bioenergetics modeling, which is a really useful tool because it's very mechanistic, and it's based on the balanced energy budget of a fish. So because fish are ectotherms, and all of their physiological rates are driven strongly and precisely by temperature, and because those rates and those physiological relationships are very easy to measure in the laboratory, we can use a balanced energy budget whereby the amount of energy that comes in as food that is consumed must be equal to the amount of energy that is lost to metabolism, to respiration, specific dynamic action, and to waste, so ingestion and excretion. What that means is that if we know something about diet and temperature and growth or consumption, we can then solve for whatever's missing in this equation. It allows us to give a quantitative measure of fish performance. So one really important input to bioenergetics modeling is temperature, and so we were able to use this TIR information, TIR information, in combination with our temperature loggers, in combination with the Landsat information, as a direct input into the model, and to make that spatially explicit. It's pretty, there's very, very few instances in the literature where somebody's actually done a fish bioenergetics model that is spatially explicit. It's usually very site-specific. And so as you can see, as I said earlier, Cutler Reservoir is incredibly heterogeneous in terms of temperature. So it ranges from highs greater than 33 degrees Celsius in the sort of lighter blue, some areas in over here, to as low as 23 degrees Celsius. So 33 degrees Celsius is lethal to most fishes, whereas 23 degrees is nearly optimal for the fishes that are in Cutler Reservoir. And so not only is it heterogeneous across the entire reservoir, it's also incredibly heterogeneous just within a small area of the reservoir, just one segment over to the next. And so the bioenergetics modeling allows us to pull in that complex heterogeneity into the physiology of the fish. Yeah.
I'm sure you worked this through, but is it shallow enough for temperatures that you can remotely detect?
Exactly.
For a good representation?
It's also completely mixed. It only stratifies.
Not stratification at all.
Yeah, it only stratifies every once in a while, and it only does it for 2 or 3 days. So you would never have an opportunity to do this in like Lake Tahoe, for example. That's a great question.
Yeah, really warm water right next to pretty temperate water there in the southern end.
Right here?
Well, yeah, but that's the streams, but a little higher up on the other side of the highway. All that, the white's right next to the purple.
Changes all the time.
Yeah, I don't know what that is. This is all because of these springs. So right on top of the spring, it's really, really cold.
If you go further up, you see it also.
Yeah, same for the springs.
And another thing that I'll come back to is that one of the most important drivers of Cutler Reservoir in terms of the stuff that we measured and modeled and analyzed is water residence time. And so there's pockets of the reservoir that hardly move at all. Then it has a really big thaw wag where the reservoir is actually operating much more like a large river. And that has a big influence on temperature as well.
It's funny, that spot that Fader was just pointing to, it's like you could put a ruler on that line.
Yeah.
Separating the red to the right and the white stuff.
Just that the west side is stagnant.
Yeah,
and
yeah.
the north side is active.
That's a suspicious break to me, just because it's so
Dramatic.
dead straight,
But you
like
got-
it's two different images.
What you got there, a series of islands, just form sort of seas. And so the only inlets are from the south and east. And those islands are sort of blocking any flow west of there. So there's a complex maze of cattail islands out there on the west side.
We did, I wasn't going to talk about this, but we did validate our helicopter temperature information with our temperature loggers, and it was incredibly precise, at least in the places that we had chose to measure. So then we can take this, this very heterogeneous thermal environment and then put it into a bioenergetics model to say, okay, well, what is fish performance? What is the potential for fish to grow in these different places and across different times? And so you can see that here for walleye, just one indicator species that we worked on in May, July, and October. And so high growth potential, or i.e. things are good for fish, is in red. Low growth potential is in blue. Things are bad for fish. And this is being driven almost entirely by temperature, because cutler is so productive that fish are limited first by temperature and only secondarily by food, and probably rarely by food. And so you can see that for walleye, things are really, really good. In the spring, the reservoir is cool. It's moderately productive. In July, a lot of the reservoir is getting too hot for walleye because they're a cool water species, but there are still some areas that are pretty good. And then in October, it's sort of somewhere in the middle. It's a little bit more, it's sort of mediocre. And the reason is because even though the temperatures are nearly ideal, the productivity has gone way down, and so there's a lot less for them to eat, potentially. And so that allows us to give every single pixel of Cutler Reservoir a fish performance metric, or fish performance score. And we can, again, do that across time and space and different species. So we won't go through this here, but here's doing this for crappie and for catfish, going across time and going across space. And so what is the take-home message from that? Well, there's an almost overwhelming influence of temperature in Cutler Reservoir. And this is, again, makes it very, very difficult to identify these covariant water quality constraints. So growth is highly variable. It's highly variable across the reservoir. It's highly variable across time. But we can quantify it, as I've shown here. And these fish are not limited by food, as they are in many systems. But we're still left with this question then, well, what is the relationship between water quality and fish performance? We now know what the relationship is between thermal heterogeneity and fish performance. We still have not addressed the question of, is the pollution of Cutler Reservoir an issue for fish? And so in order to do that, we did a variety of different things, but we started off by calculating the minimum dissolved oxygen that was available from a whole series of data through the TMDL. So we looked across time and we looked across space and we said, okay, what is the minimum dissolved oxygen level that's ever been recorded? Because we know that there are reports of summer fish kills in the reservoir, occasional ones, and there are reports of anoxia at night, which is a signal of issues for fish. And then we also kept getting this really, really strong signal in all the statistics that we were doing of season or hydrology or summer versus spring and October. And so when we started looking through the data, we found a really, really strong influence of water residence time. And again, this comes back to the fact that a lot of Cutler Reservoir is actually operating like a large river, whereas other places in Cutler Reservoir are nearly stagnant. And so there's this sort of coupling between whether or not it's a time of year when the system is very productive, and then also whether or not that water is just getting blown out of there before that primary productivity can stimulate secondary productivity, which can then be eaten by fish, et cetera, et cetera. And so we started off by calculating these metrics of sort of water quality and, I guess, almost hydrology. And then what Matt did was to stick all this information into some structural hypotheses. So we first did a random forest analysis to reduce all of our potential predictor variables. Again, we're trying to find a relationship between water quality and fish. So we could look at everything from oxygen to chlorophyll to phosphorus to nitrogen, whatever you might have. But that's not feasible. That's not biologically realistic. So Matt put all this into a series of structural hypotheses, which is a really neat statistical approach because it forces you to build a structural model that matches the hypotheses that you have about how that system is operating. And that process alone, even if you don't run the model, is really, really incredibly valuable. And then it tests to see if those relationships are significant, but not only if they're significant, if they're causal and if they're direct or if they're indirect. And so we did this path analysis to try and tease out some of those variables to look at the relationship between environmental predictors that were gleaned down to a smaller set using random forest and fish performance. And we started off with the most simple model because we did keep seeing this really strong sort of seasonal hydrology influence. And our simplest model had water residence time and temperature and eutrophication, and we used chlorophyll A as an index of eutrophication. Oh, so then we can go on to some of the results from these structured analyses. As I said, we had really, really strong seasonal patterns, and so we had to actually go back and redo the entire analysis, categorizing everything by season, because otherwise the only thing that was ever influential was season. That was the strongest signal that we would get. But after you go through that exercise, water residence time consistently scores really, really high in all these models. It's one of the most important drivers of fish performance, and it's through a variety of different links. And so you can interpret these figures over here is that a solid bold line is a significant effect, but it's not necessarily a causal effect. The lighter line is an insignificant effect, and then here's the coefficient of that relationship. And so for catfish, for example, up in the top, which is a warm water generalist species that can do well just about anywhere, it appears that there's a significant relationship between, a significant and positive relationship between temperature and catfish performance and temperature and water residence time. But it turns out that those are not causal relationships. They're spurious. So it suggests, this analysis would suggest that catfish are really not influenced by anything negatively in the reservoir. They have a positive relationship with temperature because they're a warm water species. In contrast, walleye down here on the bottom have a negative relationship with temperature and a negative relationship with water residence time, but it's through the relationship of productivity or eutrophication. And these relationships are significant and negative and direct. And so that type of structural hypothesis building and testing can be really useful to try and tease out these covariant effects, factors that are affecting fish through their effect on another factor. So what are some conclusions and implications from this study? Well, human perception is often very different from reality. Fish actually like poop up to a point, and that was a shock for some people. We saw that fish growth increased with temperature primarily, and then secondarily with eutrophication. They're not often food limited. The first most important thing in Cutler Reservoir is temperature. Water residence time is sort of the water quality or system factor that is the most important in terms of fish, and that's through its effect on average temperature and its effect on chlorophyll A or productivity. And again, it's how fast is it blowing that water out of the system before it can warm up or before it can become more productive. I think one of the things that's interesting from sort of a policy and a human standpoint from this project is that fish are actually driving the TMDL and the listing. But UDWR does not manage this system as a fishery. They will tell you we don't manage this system because we just don't think it's that important. In addition, the fishery is, in addition to being completely unmanaged, it's 100% exotic. There's no endangered species there. And the most sensitive indicator species, which is walleye, is actually a cool water species, not a warm water fish. And so it's a bunch of really kind of very strange things that are going on there with fish and the TMDL and water quality. But also, I just wanted to show you this because I wanted to show you a very integrated approach that integrates a very mechanistic, physiological way of modeling fish growth and potential. It's very feasible. It has temperature in there, so if we're talking about things like climate change, hopefully you could see that it would be pretty easy in the future to change the temperature and see how these relationships might change. It allows us to be spatially and temporally explicit, and it can allow us to identify potential relationships between things like water quality constraints and fish performance. And that's it. Any questions?
I've got one, Phaedra.
Yeah.
So this Cutler Reservoir fishery is not managed, but is there a sport fishery? I mean, does it have an angling clientele, guys that go out there and fish?
Hardly at all. We suspected that after we did this study that might increase, but there's also problems with heavy metals and PCBs and stuff like that, tertiary.
Okay. So
it has a really big clientele of water skiers. So in addition to fish driving the TMDL, it's also recreation.
I see.
What's the significance of Cutler to hydropower production?
I don't know the answer to that. Anybody?
It's a run-of-the-river reservoir. There's very little storage in it. It's part of the relicensing agreement. Pacific Corp agreed to keep it within very narrow altitude bands, elevation bands.
Right, no, I was asking about hydropower, not water storage. Is it a significant producer?
It's a run-of-the-river reservoir,
Right.
Which means that whatever water comes in from the Bear River and the Little Bear is what goes out in Cutler.
Right. Is it a significant producer of electricity?
30 megawatts, 35
Okay.
megawatts.
So is that significant to the grid?
Yeah.
Okay. I was just curious. I've always been curious about why it remains and why there isn't a significant public discussion about the removal of the dam. And so I guess 30 megawatts makes a difference.
I'm not sure much of the public, given that we didn't know.
Yeah.
I'm pretty sure the public doesn't know. I bet most of the public, people that ask them, doesn't even know it's generating electricity.
Yeah.
So, but it's not on their radar.
Yeah.
Keep it or get rid of it, it's not on public discussion, you're right. It is always striking to me that the TMDL, in a place as sophisticated scientifically as we live, seems to be one of the less scientific accomplishments or policy science. Why we're interested in the Cutler, which is the reason why we got the money, and all that money was spent up in Little Bear. Still, now, even now, especially now, makes me raise my eyebrows that we've. And then Logan's what, being asked to put in $200 to $400 million facility.
No.
I mean, that's what the numbers they throw around.
15
million.
400 or 200 million is kind of an upper end if we tear out the lagoons and replace it with the fanciest wastewater plant.
I mean, there's probably still downstream things of interest that you would care more about than, or maybe.
Yeah, it makes you wonder why. I think the state might be a little bit embarrassed by the whole TMDL process and what they're making Logan do, but their hands are kind of tied by their previous policies. And I think after they looked at the work you guys did, people were really, and you included, asking the question, well, fish are fine here. What's the big deal? And so they started, hemming and hawing and fussing around about, well, it doesn't meet the state guidelines for nutrients and blah, blah, blah. And there was this collective shrug. Well, so what? But the state does what the state does, and that's once you start a process going, then it's very difficult to get it stopped again. And that's, I think, what happened. But it also resulted in the compromise with the city and the Division of Water Quality, which is not a very expensive fix,
right,
compared to what it could have been.
How much is it again?
15 million. Down to it's
I mean,
order of magnitude
What
smaller.
would you do to save fish with $15 million? Boy, I could come up with a pretty impressive list. Yes?
Yeah. Well, and the interesting thing is it's a short-term fix. My view, I think within 20 years, we're going to be spending $250 million on mechanical wastewater treatment.
What was the fix they were proposing?
Oh, just seasonal extra phosphorus removal and more irrigation.
So with residence time in the reservoir, Jack maybe got at it with the releases that are going on, but it strikes me this variability across the seasons, right, that relates to residence time. Is the big mechanism output, or does it also have to do with, if Brian is right, and the output is simply whatever the input is, that there are certain drivers of how, when it is that there's so much water coming in that you have to move it out the bottom end, and when there isn't water coming in?
They have an arrangement that they have to keep the elevation of the reservoir constant.
Okay. So residence time is then an indicator of when there's input occurring.
Yeah.
Right. And it doesn't, as in the Santa Rafael, doesn't have a very close correlation with when there's input coming in from the sky.
Right.
Right. So you get back to that same puzzle of
That's just because Bear Lake, I mean, most of the inflow is the release from Bear Lake, which is all pumped.
Yeah. So, I mean, we get back to the same sort of understanding of what you called unpredictable human behavior as to the management of that plumbed system. And I would at least assert that it's not entirely unpredictable. In fact, it's maybe unfortunate and maybe explainable to people who aren't growing up in it, right? It seems nonsensical, or how could we possibly have constructed this system? But it doesn't seem unpredictable. It's pretty darn regular. And that piece of this model or this kind of puzzle that we need to get better at systematizing and understanding what are the actual key drivers upstream. It's not just what comes out of Bear Lake. It might be in the gross flows. I really don't know, but everything that happens between there and Cutler is probably not unimportant. What happens in the Logan, what happens in the Little Bear, what happens in the other things that are put in water, especially affecting temperature up reservoir from where the river meets, are things over which there's all sorts of manipulations going on that might well be interesting and somewhat systematic or easy or interesting to unpack.
Well, I mean, on the human side, as I understand it, there's a lot of run-of-river hydropower between, say, Bear Lake and Cutler, and lots of agricultural diversions.
I think if Eve Davies were here, she would try to explain that the oldest water rights on the entire Bear River are at Cutler Gorge. And it's a 900 second foot right, which is a fairly large water right for a river like the Bear River. And when Pacific Corp, what is now Pacific Corp, acquired those various dams, it's Bear Lake, Minnesota, Grace, Oneida, and Cutler. Only Bear Lake has any significant storage. All the rest are run of the river. And Pacific Corp, when they acquired those, they had to agree to supply water rights for all those, or water flows of water rights. So just like in the San Rafael and the Sevier, all the hydrography, most of the, probably, I don't know how much of the variance, but nearly all the variance in water flows is explainable in terms of water rights, the allocation of water rights.
Hydropower is the secondary use then?
Very much so. In fact, at Cutler, I don't think they generate much electricity at all during the summer because the Bear River Canal Company pulls it out of the top of the dam. So they only really generate that 35 megawatts in winter when it's not being used for irrigation. The other thing I find interesting is that it's designated beneficial uses for waterfowl, not just fish, but also waterfowl. And yet no one has ever done, to my knowledge, no one has ever done a population study of the birds that use Cutler Reservoir. And Audubon has actually done a study which qualified Cutler as an important bird area of global significance because it has up to 5% of the North American population whitefoot size, which is a really high percentage for a small reservoir.
Would that be because it's just overshadowed by the Bear River Refuge?
I think that's probably a good bit of it, and it's privately owned. You know, the state doesn't put any effort into regulating any of the activities on the water. So it's hunted. You know, when duck hunting season opens up, you know, the first day or two, you don't want to be there unless you're a hunter, I suppose. Man. But other than that, you know, other than the hunting use, it's not. It's a really rich resource, but no one really knows much about it.
Well, maybe that's, in the long term, maybe that's a good thing. I mean, there's opportunities there if people aren't clamoring over using it for this, that, and the other thing, and except for this little bit of power that gets produced.
It's always the debate about saving it or, you know, publicizing it.
Yeah.
Is there a connectivity between, I mean, the story of the San Rafael, clearly fish are moving into the Green River as a refuge as the tributary dewaters. We know our tributaries, some of them dewater. Does the Cutler serve a niche? Is there exchange in fish populations? Are there fish in the Little Bear, for example?
Actually came from Idaho.
But say the Little Bear, which is the one I've been focused on, is there an interesting connection between how the Little Bear is managed and what the management of Cutler means to the fish populations?
It's just such completely different types of fish, and the differences in Cutler is just really warm. Whereas all of our riverine fishes around here.
So it's not real interesting to the fish upstream.
So, yeah, so Phaedra, so when you're, so what goes on in the Logan, that's a different deal. These issues to remove barriers to longitudinal movement in the Cub so that Bonneville cuts can get down to the Bear. It's still at best coming out of the Bear River Range.
Sort of like mad to
down
get through
into
the Cutler
Bear
River.
River, but they don't think about.
They probably did historically, because
Right.
Cutler Reservoir was probably,
Well, understand.
well, yeah, it was probably a lot cooler.
In the old maps, it's Cutler Marsh.
Then they maybe even used it for
I would
rearing.
suggest that the largest single influence has been the 60 years of effluent dumping and landfilling that's been going on. I mean, that's where we had the landfill, the old concept of go fill in the marshes. That's where we continue to put waste that doesn't receive tertiary treatment. When I first came here, they had an option to put in a tertiary treatment plant essentially for 0% interest, and Logan said, nah, we've been dumping it in the marsh, we'll keep doing it forever. Well, not only Logan, but all the whole community. This is kind of a closed watershed. And the other thing, I've been to the cut water setting and looking at the impairment and stuff. The other thing you have to remember, it's a shallow reservoir. I mean, you can essentially lower the reservoir level by 6 inches and you've lost half of the volume of the water in there. The other thing that is, we have an underlying sediment base that's high in phosphorus. It acts as a sink sometimes, it acts as a source sometimes. It's kind of this sponge, and we've been kind of massaging it forever and expecting no impact. Well, those days are over. It's payback time. So any fix that we put on the reservoir now is going to be costly because it involves a lot more than what was originally at stake. And it's a little more interconnected than most people care to believe. I also want to protect the agricultural sector. There's been a lot done. Everybody always kind of points the finger at cows and cow manure. And in the time that I've been here and watching, I would say there's been a reduction by at least half of what used to happen, along with dead cows and manure spreading and contaminated water. And it's been looked at and it's been remedied. There's been some huge changes with bank stabilization and not putting dead cows in the water, that kind of thing. So I think the agricultural community should get credit for part of that.
The hard part with this is that I'm not sure if I'm not sure what the problem is in all the phosphorus that's dumped in there. Like what it has yet impaired. Now, I'm sure it has, but what exactly it is not clear to me. Or it's certainly changed the system. And what is the key indicator of interest? If the fish aren't a problem and the water skiers are happy,
I'm not sure.
Skiing on water you can't see through.
I'm not sure the fish aren't a problem. I mean, can you speak to two things? One is the relative populations of native and exotic fish.
There's no natives.
So there you go. And,
right.
And the other thing is the age classes of fish. You know, what's there. And there were some interesting findings from your studies that came out in terms of age classes.
Yeah, there's no juvenile walleye in Cutler Reservoir, which suggests that they go someplace else and they just come visit Cutler. But that's because they're a cool water fish, and when it gets too hot, they just leave. And then when it gets cool, they come back again. So
the fish that we have there can't reproduce in the Cutler, and we don't have any natives. And that seems to me to be a slight problem.
Well, short of returning it to marshland, the question is we've got this weird constructed warm water storage unit. And as a biological asset, maybe its principal value is in terms of birds and so forth right now. It has been since they've constructed it. But in terms of managing the agricultural sector, which is what brought it to the table in my desk, you'd want to, in a perfect world, be managing it in a way that accomplishes the most collective societal benefit, right? And so, is phosphorus the issue? Is water flow more than phosphorus in terms of the issues we care about in the Cutler Reservoir? If we can identify more clearly what these relationships are, you can kind of we can implement or attempt to implement fixes or changes or policy or whatever. And right now, the more I've learned in my 9 years, is that the less confident I am we've diagnosed a problem clearly enough to justify the expenditure of huge sums and the changing of people's lives and operations. Not that won't essentially be where we want to end up or where it might end up, but that it's not. I'm just musing that.
But I would submit that when one looks at a watershed and thinks about the future, it's really powerful. I mean, in this case, to me, it would be really powerful to list and inventory every projected expenditure that people contemplate to fix this, to clean up this.
Right.
And then when one does that, one sort of concludes, well, there isn't enough money, in Fort Knox to pay for all of that. And so then how do you decide which things to spend money on and which things not? And I would say at that point, in this case, it would be incumbent on us to evaluate every piece of the infrastructure and say at what point does X or Y infrastructure make sense or not. And so if it were, just very simplistically, if it were the case that the existence of Cutler Dam was not really doing much, and there were some other way to meet the guaranteed water rate of 900 C, I mean, that's a heck of a lot of water, to meet that water rate. But we were spending $1 gazillion in, the city of Logan to protect, the water quality in a facility that really didn't do very much, and it's really important, all these values that the reservoir has. I am mindful of the fact that years ago, there was a real honest debate in Missoula, Montana about the fate of Milltown Reservoir. And one of the groups that objected to the removal of Milltown Dam was the Audubon Society, because they said this is a filled-in reservoir that's a wonderful bird place. And then other people said, well, what are you, crazy? Underneath the marshes, it's all arsenic. We don't want that above our town. And other people said, well, don't mess with it. As soon as you start messing with it, you'll create something else. And, well, in that case, I think because it was arsenic and because it was trout and other things, the debate to remove won, and the waterfowl interest got rolled. In this case, there's no natives, but if you told me removal of that reservoir might reestablish and change the potential habitat for native fish, then I would think about it differently than if you told me, no, you removed it, you're not going to ever get anything out of it, and you're just creating a nightmare, and you're going to lose all the waterfowl value. But I think within an academic institution, it's sort of incumbent on us to think completely out of the box and pick some ridiculous scenario far on the edge and say, well, what's so wrong with that?
We'll be reading in tomorrow's paper that USU professor advocates removal of Cutler Dam.
Well, when I said that about Flaming Gorge Dam, and that ended up on the front page of the
They're used to you
Tribune, I
saying
almost
this.
lost my job.
Yeah, they'll say, oh, that's just Jack blowing up.
Yeah, we've heard of it.
I can say it because they can't fire me. No, I think that when you do this future stuff, you have to look at the whole deal. Because it's only going to be, it's our job, nobody else's job, to think outside of the box and tell people when we're making
Kind scared of you guys already. You don't need to be outside the box.
Well, even inside the box, I don't disagree with you, but even inside the box, if we were to put a proposal in to understand a system better so that it could be managed in a way that produces ecological outcomes we care about. Question is, what are those ecological outcomes we care about right now? What are the as I naively look at our agricultural landscape and Cutler and Little Bear and so forth, the ecological benefits are, view sheds are ecological services. There's probably a fair bit of wildlife, mostly riparian area stuff that we partly have just constructed, but it's providing that now, and it's something that would be lost if the system performance changes. The nutrient side of the story is not as clear as it was when I was introduced to this area, as that being the thing around which we should manage. But how would you manage this? To understand the plumbing would give you the tools to manage it, and if we can simultaneously understand the ecological implications of changes in plumbing, we'd then be able to say, well, here's some interesting ways to think about how you can accomplish how do we maintain some of the agricultural objectives if we're to change them and water diversions and water right reallocations in some world? How would we do that in a way that retains maximizes benefits that other than the current uses that we actually care deeply about, right? So what would those implications be? I don't think we can have that conversation because honestly, I don't see us having the capacity to even understand how the system is operating very clearly.
I think you have the capacity, but There's so little known about it. I mean,
What's what I mean?
I find it
We have the
appalling.
capacity to potentially do it, otherwise we couldn't sell, an agency to give us the money. But I don't think right now we understand and have the ability to represent in our models the way in which water is being managed and how that impacts the hydrology and how it impacts the ecology all as one piece. And that's why I set out
And
on
the
this
potential
journey on this
diversion
trip.
of water downstream from the Bear and the routing of that water to the Wasatch Front.
Then
makes
becomes
these-
some really interesting puzzles we'd superimpose and say, what is that going to mean? But whether we can even go to that until we figure it out in fundamental ways what the implications are of changing the efficiency of water use, reallocating rights to urban, the kind of things that we've listed in our proposal. What are those going to mean in terms of the dynamics of this system? And as that occurs, how can we bring into the conversation? And the reason I'm very excited about having Karen and Phaedra and Michelle involved is, we're interested in some of the complex implications that are ecological in the end. I mean, I honestly don't, that is one of the major pieces of this puzzle. The connections need to be made. You need to be able to say, how do we bring that into the
I attended a
optimization?
planning and zoning commission meeting last night, and they were adopting a code that essentially will plan for all the development in Logan.
Right.
A couple issues were brought up, and the council was smart enough to figure out that they don't have enough information to base their solid decision on something. So they were running a meeting that's very parallel to this one, except you guys have all the answers and you don't have the application. And those guys have the application but don't know the answers exist. Essentially what's got to happen is those guys have to be able to feel comfortable coming to you and asking questions, pointed questions, and then you can run your scenarios and you're out of the box and all that. But it's got to have a practical application, something that they can use to base a decision that they can defend. And what I saw last night, there was no public input. Nobody showed up. A couple of concerned guys that run a management company here in town, and myself, because one of the things they talked about doing was, again, coming to an irrigation company, and one of the costs of development was to strip a water share from me and change that water share from an agricultural use to a culinary use for drinking water. Kind of see the concept, but I don't like it because it comes to me and takes water from an agricultural use, and it's not even my water to give away. It's a right to use water, and it's not even a finite quantity. It changes by time. And then all of a sudden they want that to be well, you know what happens. The quick fix is the developer comes to a widow or a farmer, buys the share for $100, dedicates it to the city. Well, the city's got 200 such shares that they've taken from my company personally over the years, and they haven't put it to beneficial use. They keep water banking, saying this is for future growth potentially. And I can agree with that, but you cannot hoard water. And they're hoarding water and not using it and essentially taking it out of circulation. And rather than using a practical approach that might be gray water or secondary irrigation system or something innovative that you guys come up with, or realize the cost of some of their moves, that if you take that share, it's going to cost this, like he was saying, an inventory of all the stuff that's generated by this water. I think you'll see that the need is there for accurate information, and we don't have it. And the people that are making decisions don't have it, and we're being asked to make decisions that are quite frankly scary because of the implication for future water use. And all the things you've talked about, over allocation, use it, don't lose it mentality, this whole thing of dumping water on the ground just to essentially say you've used it. I mean, robbing Peter to pay Paul, those days have got to quit. And you've got to see what the actual cost of those things happen. So
I don't think you've got the data locally, and I don't think you've got it globally. For example, Wayne Wurzbach did some of the first macroinvertebrate studies in Cutler, just a couple of years ago. His students, it wasn't even really sponsored research, university research. You had a couple of students that went out there for a few hours. What's with that? macroinvertebrates are some of the key drivers of ecological health. What they found was you got basically worms out there. I mean, it's very, very low stuff, very pollution tolerant. I mean, it's a real mess. And then there's just a little bit further downstream, you get the Great Salt Lake. So if you start taking this water and causing it to evaporate, then you start to lower this level of the Great Salt Lake. And that's a whole nother set of issues which we're just conveniently ignoring because it's over this minor ridge to the west of our valley. And that's, that doesn't make sense to me.
Phaedra, I don't know, I mean, since Michelle left, she was probably the person to really address this with, but in terms of phosphorus potentially as a driver of the system, is anybody measuring, phosphorus loading and primary production response to that or anything like that? They did that as part of the TMDL. So that data's out there. Yeah,
actually, one of the things why I wanted to talk about color today is because I do, like I said in my talk, I do think it has a pretty big promise for us to use this. I mean, not just color.
That's an interesting system, yeah.
It's interesting, it's close to home. A lot of us have dabbled in it.
Mhm.
And so, and the TMDL was a pretty massive effort. There's, extensive bathymetry. There's there's a lot of
information
lot of
now that
information.
wasn't there
It's not-
5 years ago.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's
Well,
not synthesized, it's not in a cohesive format, nobody's taken the time to say, what does it all mean, but it is there. And somebody else might be interested in paying us.
Yeah.
Well, the city's paying us to monitor in Cutler. We're monitoring tributaries going in, so and
Find
it
out where it's
includes
coming from.
primary productivity, but not fishery stuff. We looked at sediment fluxes and a bunch of things.
And part of the story, part of the fish story that I'd always been told, now this is a good time to ask it true, is that essentially the existence of all these carp is stirring up so much sediment that there's not enough light getting in to eutrophy the reservoir. It has a nutrient load that were the water not stirred up would probably experience problems, more typical problems with eutrophication in larger, deeper reservoirs.
That happens in a lot of places, and that's what's happening in Utah Lake.
So they're handling
But I'm dubious about it in Cutler because of exactly what I said, and that is that the water just doesn't stay there very long.
Okay.
There are places where you
Yeah.
can call it hyper-eutrophic during certain times of the year. The DO goes to 0 and at night and temperatures are high.
But I think there wasn't enough biological activity among the algae or the chlorophyll or something
But that premise says then that the number of carp is increasing, and nobody's gone out to see if that's
No,
the case.
well, yeah, it'll take a long time to figure that out.
What would be native, what would you call a native fish in this part of the world?
Well, historically, there would have been some minnows in there, leatherside chub, perhaps dace, and trout would have gone in and out, I'm sure, historically. They just can't now.
Yeah, it's too
They would have
long.
used it to go get big and fat, and just like going to the ocean.
There is an 1898 record of a leatherside chub.
Yeah.
On
It's
the
their range.
border of Utah and Idaho on the Bear.
And then some suckers.
What
Native
about
suckers.
these kokanee that are up in Porcupine?
Well, how are we doing for time
We've
here?
got 15 minutes. Do you want to just take a quick
Yeah,
moment to review what you were going to talk about?
sure. So well, let's see if we can put it up here. I just took the,
Want to wear the mic?
sure, I can do that.
You can hear the room mics okay though, Rob?
Yep, they're fine.
Okay. So at the end of Friday, for I think most of you were here, for those of you who weren't, we did a little exercise getting everybody to just kind of try and think about the same system with their different disciplines in one little scenario. And the scenario very generally was a stretch of riparian area that's currently, or a stretch of river or stream or whatever that's currently in agriculture that was transitioning to development, housing or whatever. And just sort of a very general exercise to kind of get people thinking about what it meant to think about all the interactions in that system. What would we have to understand about that system to really start asking these questions? What are all these variables we need to understand?
And so then at the end, just as everybody was taken off, I asked everybody to please write down on a piece of paper what was tough about that exercise. And so,
The white one on the.
Right in front of you. No, literally right in front of you.
that, right in front of me. Okay, cool. So I just typed those all up so that you can see that. And I did send it to Rob so he can also see it. That's not the right direction. We'll see if I can get it down so you can see it all here.
Actually, bigger's better.
Bigger's better, even if you can't see them all?
If I can't see it all, you can scroll, but.
Okay. We'll look at the first half. So I'll give you a second to look at that, but there are a couple of themes in there, and I feel like some of the challenges were kind of related to the scale issue we're talking about. Who measures what at what scale, and sometimes those are hard things to reconcile, even if you know you're measuring something that somebody else needs. If you're not measuring it at the scale somebody else needs it, to understand how it fits in with their system. There's some issues with that. And then there's some just sort of disciplinary challenges as well. What the heck is human dimensions? What do these sociologist crazy people measure?
She just called you crazy.
I think so too.
No, she's quoting someone else.
He was my master's
She has a
advisor
master's
after all.
degree in sociology. She's not
Right.
to criticize.
I pretty clearly heard her say she thought you were crazy.
And she would know.
She would know.
Now scroll down.
Right?
Let's move on, please.
We divert the attention. Oh, look at that. Reactionary forces. Didn't mean to put the dash
I like
there.
economics with a question mark.
Yeah, I like that too.
Yes or no?
Right.
Please.
So, in part, I just show you this to kind of put it out there to everybody, and I realize that about half of the people who were there last week aren't here today. But to put it out there that everybody's struggling with this, and I think what the struggle is very helpful to understand, because it helps us understand how we move forward in terms of trying to integrate things. So I just wanted to put that up there kind of as something to react to if you feel like, but also then just turn it back to discussion space and spend the next 6 minutes or so just saying, what were your impressions of that exercise, and did anybody learn anything that might be useful as we move forward? I'll just sit back down now.
Our group, it wasn't necessarily a disciplinary problem. It was there was too many variables. You could vary too many things in too many dimensions. So I wanted to just pick something and go forward, but the other people in my group wanted to consider all the things that could vary. So that was sort of a long-winded and not very clear way of saying it wasn't necessarily a disciplinary problem. It was more just a
undisciplinary problem.
Yeah, how would you tackle this kind of assignment or something? So I think if we were to do something like that in the future, for my group anyway, we'd have to be in a different group, or or we'd have to put some boundaries on something. You know, you can't. Okay, if we assume that Farmer J is going to do blah, then
Right, rather than renegotiating the premise.
yeah.
Anybody else have? I wasn't here last time,
I
but
wasn't
it was
here either, I'm
interesting.
sorry.
It says, how do you, I don't know exactly what it says, but how do you determine what ultimately matters?
Right,
We're-
that,
we're
and that
mentioned-
question showed up a couple of times
We're
up
so
there.
dependent in what we do in our work or in our lifestyle or whatever. We're so dependent, but yet we're so interdependent. And we don't know what part of the interdependency is that critical to us. I mean, we lose our food supply, it's going to be pretty critical to us, okay? And so I think that's the important I guess, focus here is to somehow create a group that can have some vision or understanding of what is ultimately important. And how do you, I mean, color's important, and we're doing what we can to clean it up, and we're gonna put some money into it. And there are those who think, well, it won't do anything anyway, and there are those that think, well, we gotta do something. I'm not saying don't do anything, but how do you determine, you sit down with some focus group and say, okay, these are our ultimate goals. This is where we ultimately want to be. Even if your dependent part of it doesn't get as much as it ought to, it's where we're heading anyway. Anyway, just discussion.
Yeah. One thing that disturbs me about that question is that few people ask, how much latitude do people who come after us need? People raise that question, and they raise it as, we need some insight here about what do we really want. But no one, very few people seem to ask, what are people going in 100 years going to need?
Right.
How much, for example, how much oil and gas do we need to leave for people 100 years from now in case between now and then we can't figure out some alternative? And so how much of a buffer? And how do we live not just within our means, but within our means with a cushion? Mm-hmm. And no one seems to be asking that question. And it seems to me we have a responsibility to those folks, even though we don't know them. Because we sure wish people 100 years ahead of us, or us, certainly.
And those issues are in front of us right now with the canal rebuild in place, or, how do we rework that so that it's good for people in 2100? Right. Not for me tomorrow. Yeah.
Although we do have to pay attention for you tomorrow.
Well, but anyway.
No, but you're right. How do you have that conversation? The science, the role of science in that is probably easily overestimated. In other words, as I have negotiated these kinds of puzzles, I don't think the science is going to tell us what we care about. So there has to be a moment where we say, what is it we're trying to do here? What do we care about? What science can do is and I can't imagine doing it without the science, although we do pretty normally do it without the science. Because there's never enough science, right? We just can't get enough.
The scientists anyway.
Right. But, if we can simultaneously get clear signals about what's this going to mean for A, B, C, D, and E, then you can turn to a group of scientists and say, well, what's it going to mean for A, B, C, D, and E? And science can kind of play that out, and then you have to have really just a political and public social value discussion about how important is A, B, C, D, and E, and what are the trade-offs going to be. The best we'll do with this collaboration is get our hands wrapped around the right puzzles so that we're addressing the questions or providing the right science to facilitate that kind of conversation. See what I mean? Mm-hmm. And that means there's got to be a moment where we figure out what are all the voices that need to be there to help identify A through E. And that could easily include, societal conversation about long-run kinds of interests. And I'm then able to draw boundaries to say, okay, we're going to be interested in the things, these are the things that we're going to pay most attention to, because we can't look at all possible impacts of all possible connections of all possible things. We don't do that. And it felt that way, I know, a little bit last week, but the point is, okay, let's brainstorm those. And then within that complexity, you end up zeroing in on a tractable set of questions you can answer in any given project, and then a collection of projects might begin to build the bigger picture. So what does the council need to know? What does the county talk about? What are groups outside those talking about that might be voices that'll be part of that weighing and sifting the values, right? Get that figured out for a landscape like this, and then let's be really clear on what the unanswered questions are.
Well, dependently, you have the Great Salt Lake. I mean, there are people who are interested in
absolutely
what's around the Great Salt Lake, and there are people who want to extract minerals out of the Great Salt Lake. They want to build bigger ponds. You move upstream, you have the Wasatch Front wants to build.
So it's not just our valley. I agree. Yeah.
They want to build another project, and you go above the valley, and you got the Bear Lake, and it seems like to me that in the development process, we've slowed the water down, okay? To have agriculture work, you build dams in the west, you slowed the water down, okay? We use Bear Lake, not only for Cache County, but Box Elder County. It seems like when you convert to urban, you're gonna slow it down more. Because to have an urban supply, you have to lengthen the time that you can use it, even a longer time than agriculture can use it. So really what's gonna happen is you slow it down more. That's what you're really doing.
Actually,
The more you
urban
develop,
areas
the
may
more you're gonna
speed
slow
it
it
up.
down. What?
Urban areas may speed it up. When you divert it and then flush it, that's a lot faster process than when you put it on alfalfa.
But as it grows, you need more.
That's a
You
different
need
dimension.
more in December, and ag needs it when it would have sped right through the system and been gone. If you're gonna try to use it for something else, you're gonna have to slow it down somehow.
That's a really interesting thing, if you just stylistically, agricultural signature on the hydrograph, and there's the urban signature. The shifting uses in those two pathways, it will potentially, in an urbanizing landscape,
You
have
flush it, it goes down, but you gotta have a
implications
source now.
for what that river
As urbanization occurs, you need a source for a longer period of time. And so that's why you're gonna be interested in using Bear Lake for the Wasatch Front. How are you gonna manage that? And that's the big supply. You know, what's gonna happen to that in 2025?
Right.
You know, find out that what they build won't supply. You know, you're just gonna, from the time that it takes the water to get downstream. Because as urbanization occurs, you have to have it for a longer period.
Now, I think climate science has introduced another dimension that's been really intriguing to me, and I think some of the others of uncertainty. The problem with future climates is not that we don't know what they
Right.
It's not what they will be, but that we don't know what they'll be. And the need therefore to adjust our system so we make provisions for a wider range of realities. That's been a language that I think has been, at least in the public sector, is totally new as a result of climate science explanations. And I think is really intriguing. The problem then being, how do we plan for uncertainty? How do we develop our systems? How do we plan? I'm thinking about planting different kinds of cottonwoods as a result. Because I may need cottonwoods that can adapt to a wide range of temperatures, not just woods.
I think Brian brought up a good point. How much are you gonna save? Because what you do save is there for the natural system. You know, so which block of it are you gonna separate and say, okay, even though we're gonna develop, we're not gonna develop this block. It's always gotta be there. It's,
I don't think we get to set the priorities or the parameters. I think we ought to go back to kind of the basic function here is a land grant college that has cooperative extension. So that's the format to go forward with. We have to be prepared for every scenario with all the answers, all the right answers. So that when people come and ask, the trust is there to believe what they're hearing from the university people and from people that have experienced rather than, and then you still, that fuzzy part that's getting a lot of emphasis now, the socioeconomic things, that's a double-edged sword. I mean, the more you learn, the more it's fickle and comes back at you, and I don't think you can ever quantify it, so you just gonna have to be ready for the guys that show up at your door so that when they come with their scenario and their priorities, you give them point-blank information that's based in science that they can take and hopefully use the way you'd like them to, but just because you give them the right answer doesn't mean they're gonna take it. I've seen people, just the fact that you gave them the answer, they're gonna turn the other way and go, we ain't doing that. Those fellows up to the college are, you know. So again, you're gonna find those innovative people and those innovative places where you can fit your scenario with their current needs. And once we get a couple of those under our belt, then we can start the what if scenario. But right now, you got to play with what you got.
To be realistic, and this may be comforting more than alarming, given last week, I guess, that was just meant to sort of be let's remind ourselves about how complicated this is and that we have a purpose, but I'm not sure we have a clarity of purpose. Charles and I just went through an intensive grant writing exercise around a puzzle of this sort of collaborative, integrated systems science. And to be tractable, you will pick off, a narrowly circumscribed puzzle within an obviously interconnected, complicated system. What you hope to do is to pick the biggest, most important, and core parts of what drives that system around the objects that you're interested in. Here we look at sedimentation, and this wasn't in Utah, but sedimentation ends up being the one thing that you're going to focus on, even though there are other things that will be important. And we think that there are certain kinds of behaviors that are the big levers. That's the human piece of this. So that's going to be hard enough, figuring out the hydrology and figuring out the complexity of the human behavior when they are cast fairly narrowly around how they impact a certain kind of outcome in the system. And what I now more clearly envision is that to bite this off, we're going to probably bite off several things like that. So the Cutler Reservoir could be a focal point of a really interesting complex system science. How does that system operate? How does it operate relative to upstream and downstream? What's the human dimension of that are key drivers? It's going to be a subset of key drivers. It's not like all of society. And then you have to get the right people involved that can equip and bring to the table the ability to understand those key physical and human levers that are involved. We might have a different kind of deal if we were to pick a different part of this landscape, where Cutler is not the centerpiece, but that's what it's going to look like next spring. For now, I'm entirely enjoying learning about what everyone's doing and beginning to see what the breadth of our capacity can be. And then I think we'll end up having to form kind of focused teams at some point next spring that say, here's either a single project around which we're all going to decide how we can hammer it out, or a couple of parallel projects that are integrated but that will probably get manifest as maybe different scales or different points on the landscape, or a different environmental or integrated human system, natural system puzzle. And I think the one we tried to throw out to you last week when Lorraine and I brainstormed that is a interesting puzzle. What happens when land converts from agricultural to residential use? What happens to the hydrology? If you want, and we tried actually at the end not to give very much information about what to look for, because people then would speculate about, what do I care about? Do I care about the water flow? Do I care about the water use? Do I care about the quality? Do I care? Does anyone have fish in their model? Do people looking? Is that even an issue? In that land conversion process, what are the important ecological outcomes that might be worth talking about?
And well, that's what both from the model development standpoint and just the discussion standpoint, that how do I figure out what really matters? What are those key drivers, or what are those key parts of the system that change? So
yeah, and we've built into the grant something we haven't yet done, which is some systematic interactions with real world stakeholder. I mean, Peter's here, Bob's here, I've tried to invite in others, but that's a subset of people willing to go for this incredibly long haul of going to a lot of meetings on a campus. I think grounding our feet in a couple of puzzles, we might find that there's a constellation of issues and actors and a little bit more focus in a particular place that will then provide that element for us of how we draw boundaries. Right? It'll make like around a real place and real problem instead of a hypothetical place where everything matters still. And that's where we decide what we care about for the purposes of that project. And hopefully, if we do it right, we wrote into the grant, if we do it right with that kind of base touching with applied water managers, the results of the project will actually be somewhat useful to somebody. Seriously, that they'll have been along for the ride. I'm not saying that doesn't always happen. But if you build it into the front end and they're along for the ride, the chances are a lot better that they're going to believe it and that they're going to integrate it in ways we never expected into discussions and decision making, right? And that means it's a little different way of doing the science, where we don't just think of what the really interesting scientific hypothesis is, but we build at the outset that we've got a complicated societal puzzle here that this science could address, and they're not able to answer. No one really knows what happens if you take those water rights and you do this form of planned development, right? No one knows. So we could take that one off. What happens in, sketch the landscape, sketch the scenario,
Certainly be handy.
build off of that. Or what happens if we manage the water
I'm
in
gonna
the
stop
valley
you
in a
because we're
particular
late.
way for this particular objective? What's that gonna do? Right? So we go from there. We've gone over time. Thank you for coming last Friday. We're gonna take a break. I will be doodling you all. Don't be offended. To figure out what the time block will be starting in January. I meant to do that by now, but I got kind of busy this week, so I'll be doing that maybe even before I leave today. So sitting here plugging.
Bye.
Bye, Rob.
That was after the